This morning I thought I'd say a bit about my journey moving from practicing a meditation technique to what I would call practicing meditation with no technique. And in order to do that, I wanted to go back a bit in time and talk about how I got started on the path of meditation and how fairly recently, after some 20 odd years later, a significant shift has occurred in my meditation practice. And before I begin, I just wanted to say that I acknowledge that my experience is my experience, and it's based upon my interpretation of these matters, which in turn are influenced by my personality, my tendencies, my personal history. And I don't want to put a value judgment on one practice or the other. It's really just noticing how the different phases of my journey have impacted my understanding. So after I'd had my first spiritual experience, I found how to tell this story without going into lots of detail, but basically, when I was traveling before I went to university, I had my first conscious spiritual experience. I mean, there were other things that had led up to that, but let's just say that was my first kind of experience, which I named as being spiritual. And then when I started university, I found a student society that was teaching meditation, and I decided to join because I wanted to stay connected to this profound feeling of love and connection that I'd awakened to. And as a result, I ended up becoming deeply involved in a yoga, meditation, social service organization that was based on the Tantra yoga tradition. And so through that, I learned a series of meditation lessons, as they were called, or practices or techniques to the ultimate goal is self-realization, the ongoing realization of the individual self as being part of the universal self, the universal consciousness. So there I was practicing these techniques that were very specific, usually involving a process of withdrawal from the outside world and leading to the use of mantra, internally repeated sounds or words from the Sanskrit language, which have a meaning that, when focused upon, is bringing the idea and the feeling of this oneness and union with the cosmic self. And these practices were transformational for me. I had I'd grown up in London, and as a teenager I had a lot of exposure and access to, drugs, alcohol, party lifestyle. So to then discover meditation and, basically it led me to a very pure lifestyle that was based on this, this natural high of spiritual experience, which is a beautiful gift. And I continued to practice these techniques for many years. And at some point, because of the changing circumstances of my personal life and my perspective, a lot was influenced actually by becoming a mother and just the very being thrown into the very mundane realities of being a parent, that I began to, firstly just to struggle to do meditation regularly, because having a baby and young children made it hard for me to keep up that discipline. So I had to really let go of that attachment to that daily practice. And I also started to want to explore ideas around the sacred feminine and what that meant, and I was getting involved in women's circles at that time and realizing that there was a very patriarchal element to the organization that I was in, and I wasn't happy with the way that I was looking at the world through actually a more narrow lens than I wanted to be. I wanted, the whole point of these practices was to help me be more open-minded, and I felt that I'd become more closed actually. So I stepped away from the formal practice and the formal organization, but I continued to use my mantra, and I didn't ever discover another practice to replace it, even though I was open to finding something different. And so if I ever did meditation, or if I ever wanted a technique to calm myself down or enable me to feel more connected to my spiritual self, then I would use the mantra or the techniques that I'd learned to do that. I'm just going to move into the sunshine because there is some sunshine this morning, and rather than shivering, I will try and go into it. So this was the situation for then quite a few years after that. I think it was about let's say about 12 years of being deeply inside that practice. And then for about 8 years I was just kind of living and, integrating spirituality in my daily life with my family, but I wasn't doing any formal practice. And it was during that time that we moved to Portugal and we were living on the land, and that was in itself a beautiful experience and journey of connecting with nature and all the joy and insight that brought. The sun's going in again now, and it's windy and cold. So then in 2020, I started to get inspired again to practice meditation regularly, and I returned to the practice that I'd been doing before because that's what I knew and that's what came in and was available to me. And I attended a retreat for the first time in 8 years, again with the same community, the same organization that I'd been involved with before, and it was a real igniting again of that spark and that devotion and that dedication to spiritual practice and to my spiritual life. It was like a bit of a reset. And I returned again to practicing that mantra-based meditation very regularly for over a year. But then in 2021 a new kind of energy came in, and I started on a year-long exploration with a group of women, which is called the 13 Original Clan Mothers, and it's a series of explorations inspired by Native American teachings, and it's very much about finding one's truth. And very quickly in this journey, what arose for me was that I'm shivering again, trying to still my body. What arose for me was that rather than practicing a technique that was taught to me by someone else and following a set of instructions, that I needed to listen to the wisdom from inside myself, my intuitive self, my inner guidance. And so I began to let go again of the technique and just open to what was coming from inside myself. Now that sounds very simple and, not easy, but not particularly confronting, but actually what came about was this huge onslaught of fear, mainly fear, that by abandoning the technique that I'd been taught, that I would somehow fall from grace, that all these ideas about this kind of vengeful, punishing God came up, and I was just, I don't know, I felt so much anger that well, it was mainly fear, yeah, that I was going to, that by not following the technique that I'd been taught by, teachers that I respected and that came from the guru that I had revered and, pledged an oath to, basically, because that was part of my initiation into the Tantra Yoga path, that, I was basically doing something terrible, and it was very frightening. It was like, maybe I'll be punished, essentially, for doing this, which is crazy because that was never... I'm so cold, I have to go somewhere warmer. Because this idea of punishment was never part of the teaching that I was following. It was just, I guess, old fear and old stories about spirituality, and based on religion and all the dogmas that go along with that. This so-called short story has not been so short. There's still more to go, because so basically I opened myself up to this very intuitive exploration of when I would sit to do meditation. I didn't follow any technique, but I was just trying to follow this intuition that feeling oneness should be effortless, because it is the natural state of the self, is to feel connected and one with everything. But what I didn't understand at that time, had really comprehended, and what came to me when I started to explore the non-duality teachings, was that, yes, the self is one with the universal self. However, there is this ego mind, this sense of the separate self, that unless there is awareness brought to it, will continue to impose this perception of separateness on my experience. And I thought of this metaphor earlier, which is like, the mind is like a fish tank, and the thoughts are darting through it like different coloured fish. Sometimes there are lots of fish, sometimes there are a few, sometimes there's just one going round and round in circles. And doing the meditation with the technique as I was doing before, and I'm not saying that everyone approaches it in this way, but the way that I understood it and practiced it was that I was inside the fish tank, trying desperately to clear the thoughts away by doing all these, following the instructions and trying to do it correctly, so that I would just feel the water of the fish tank. And what changed when I started really exploring about the ego and the illusion of the separate self was that I realized I'm outside of the fish tank. And perhaps the whole room beyond the fish tank is full of water as well. I am the water, but I'm not inside the tank. I can see everything that's going on inside the tank. I can see the fish darting across in all their different colours and shapes and sizes. But I don't need to be in there changing how they behave. So what changed in my meditation practice then, when I started to explore non-duality, was I don't need to do anything. I don't need to do anything other than be and observe from the place of this witnessing consciousness. And I don't even need to try to observe. I just need to be with what is going on internally. The thoughts, the words, the images, the sensations, the feelings, the emotions. Just to hold them. And the practice is different every single time. And that's fine, that is as it is. And sometimes everything is very peaceful, sometimes it's very loud and busy and noisy, sometimes I'm getting lots of ideas, sometimes it's just inane chatter. But just being with it and allowing everything to arise without it being a problem. And it's not about controlling the state of the mind, which is what I felt like I was doing for a long time. With the techniques that I was practicing, it was about controlling my mind rather than realizing I am observing the mind. And the I that is observing the mind is always in a state of peace. So it doesn't matter what the mind is doing, because I am beyond that. That was a much longer video than I was expecting to make today. I hope it makes some sense.